Hey guys, looking at Ismael Fassi's and Otis Lawrence's driving style for a spa track guide. This is WRT1. Two very similar lap times, but two different driving styles. Let's look at it. Key, turn one, I want to be braking 100% a tad before the 100-meter board. So by the time you're at the 100-meter board, 100% on the braking. So there's a tiny bit of overlap just in his driving style. He's known, he likes to flick. He likes to apply a lot of steering angle really quickly. He sometimes understeers somewhat, and he's sometimes too early on throttle application. So let's look for that. So why is he understeering? Well, it's amount of how much you drop the brakes. So here he's dropping the brakes for this corner. He drops it only to 30%. Very different than Otis Lawrence, who drops the brakes a lot more. 30%, a lot of steering lock. You want to be like using a good amount of distance to the apex. You want to be on this curb right here. Interesting that he keeps it in third all the way to the apex and then shifts to second after the apex. So that's tricky. That's a bit tricky for your throttle application. And I like to, I've looked at a lot of laps of this track. A third to second midway between corner entry and the apex, it gives you a little extra boost of rotation. But obviously, if you're already in a good trajectory, or if you feel like the car's unstable, that downshift from third to second could upset the car. So obviously, it's probably a personal preference or a reaction to how the car's feeling on entry. Then a big jump on throttle, and then back to second, now to third, then using ERS. Let's look at Otis Lawrence's, how he does turn one. So Otis Lawrence turn one, similar braking point, starting at the 100-meter board. He doesn't overlap. He's much better on the brakes and the throttle application. But look how much he drops the brakes. He drops it all the way down to 5%. Then he just completely drifts the car into turn one. Now, neither of these were, they weren't faster or slower than the other. And I don't even think these were great turn one corners. So he drifts the car in. Now he's on no inputs, heading towards the apex. Very different. We've seen him do some big drifts like this before at Abu Dhabi at the track guide there. But yeah, it's just something that he likes to do a lot. He'll be so loose on the car, or he'll get so much oversteer that he'll be drifting to the apex. The disadvantage of that is it could reduce some of your minimum apex speed, because you're just scrubbing off so much speed at the corner. But obviously, it gives you really good entry speed. So if you wanted to look at just his delta, so looking at his delta, he gets up like a tenth just on the entry, and then obviously he loses it some on the exit. So it wasn't even that great of a corner, but it's very interesting. That's something he likes to do. Let's look back to Ismael Fahssi here. Look how much he drains the battery down into the first sector. Very similar for sector ones. But I think you could definitely be faster. You could maybe be a 29 high in sector one. So looking at this next braking point, the back of the car at the 100-meter board is when I would like to start. You want to start braking. So you see the back of the car gets to the 100-meter board, or even just a bit past that, maybe the back of the car at the curb. Then you start braking again. There's a lot of inputs here. Big amounts of turn in here. There's a lift, and then a big 90% jump on throttle here, and then a bit of a modulation here, and keeping this section flat. And then obviously draining the ERS here. So here, next corner up here is a tricky corner. The back of the car at the curb is when you can start braking. Only 90% braking. It doesn't need to be 100%. But he gets a lot of understeer. So there's kind of two different approaches. There's a double apex approach, which he kind of does, but he kind of understeers, and he doesn't really hit the second apex, or it's to keep it tight. I think it's easier, and I think it's faster if you keep it really tight. Here, I'll show you Otis Lawrence and how he keeps it tight in that section. So here's Otis Lawrence, similar braking point, but he drops the brakes a bit more. He's not as much steering lock, so he's a tendency to not as understeer as much. Keeps it very tight in this corner, but he has a bit of a moment at the on his throttle application, so that's why he actually loses some time there. So just coming into that corner, he was up. He was up half a tenth, but then just at that moment right there, it loses some time. Let's go back to Fahssi. Here we go. So at this section right here, I would say at the front, or as either the front of a car is at this AWS sign, or the midpoint of the car is at the AWS sign. You want to do a lift, and when you're lifting, you generally want to lift before you get to the apex. So he does a decent job of this, where he's lifts before, and then by the time he's at the apex, he's back on throttle. Let's look at how Otis Lawrence does that. Let's see when does he lift. So he's not lifting. He lifts a tiny bit here, but then he realizes, oh, I need to lift even closer. I need to do a double lift. So I need to lift again, and he actually just taps a bit of the brakes. So this is not a good corner right here. So look, he was half a second ahead of his delta. Now he's a little bit behind on his delta. Obviously that's moving around a lot, but it just shows you how a couple corners you can lose a lot of time there. Let's go back to Fahssi. See how he's burning his battery. Yeah, so burning the battery down here. There's a flat section here, so he's down to 50 at this point, but it could be a bit tricky. So I would say you want to, at the back of the cars at the 50-meter board, that's where you want to turn in. If you're struggling, maybe you want to do a bit of a lift, but 7th gear all throughout that, and then maybe switching to none on the ERS mode to make it easier to hit that corner. Next section here, back of the cars at the curb, about 80% braking, flick the car in. So this is where he does a bit of a double throttle. So he jumps on throttle once. Let's go back. He's a bit early on his throttle application. So he's on throttle. Oh, then he gets off the throttle. Then he gets back on the throttle. That's why I think he's a bit aggressive, too aggressive and too early on the throttle. So here we go. Next corner up here. At the front of the cars at the curb. That's when I would start braking. And then he does that. He touches the throttle a bit again too early. So let's look one more time. So yeah, back here. So heavy on the braking, 80%. Flick the car in. He's on throttle a bit here. So he's on throttle a bit too early. Then he gets off the throttle. Then he's still on the brakes. And you want to get a little bit closer. And he could be on this curb just a little bit. And then, jump on throttle there. Then a flat section and a pretty easy section all throughout here. So Otis actually made up, almost a 10th in sector 2. Even though, obviously, we saw Otis had some mistakes there. But still. But Fahssi a lot faster in sector 3. I think he burns a bit more ERS, so he's all the way down to 9%. And I think he has a little bit better of the last corner. But let's look at the last corner. Back of the car. Sorry. As you get to the 100-meter board, you want to be 100% on the brake. So you're starting the braking a bit before 100 meters. But when you're at the 100 meters, you want to be 100% on. The big flick in. You just drop the brakes about 20-30%. Jump on throttle. Yeah, and apply a bit of throttle, then jump completely off the throttle. Now this is the way he does the third to second, which is good. So if you want to get a little rotation into that corner, a third to second downshift will definitely help. Third to second, then a bit jump on throttle, all the way line. So both of them were not too happy with their lap, but let's look at Otis Lorenz again. You can see here, more patient and more precise with the big throttle jump. Again, there's a tiny bit of a lift there, which is fine. And then here, trailing all the way to the apex, and the time he gets on the throttle, he's at the apex, not before. Let's look at the final sector, or the final curb. That's a difficult one. So you're braking, and then you're getting some onto the curb. So you're not really braking so much in a straight line. You're getting onto this curb here to open up the corner. Drops the brakes. He drops the brakes kind of early. So he's off the brakes is something I noticed. Look, he's off the brakes at this point. And he gets a lot of curb here. I think maybe a bit too much. That slows him down. Then no third to second downshift. And he does braking there. So instead of a downshift, he just goes third and does a bit of braking. That could be one reason why he's slower in the final sector. Let's look at the laps stacked on top of each other. This is all easy. It's easy to see more of the differences in the laps when we stack them on top. So we'll see turn 1, big difference in turn 1. Look, there's a drift versus a strong flick. And look at here. Look, he's on the brakes. Here there's no brakes. And the amount of steering. So Otis is having to counter steer. So look how much he's going to open up the steering because he's drifting. Versus Fahssi, a lot of steering angle. And then obviously that shift is second. Let's skip ahead to the next corner. So next corner, we can see how, a bit more of a jump maybe by Otis. Here, this is where we're going to see the difference of the racing line. So similar amounts of steering angle. Just Otis is able to get the car slowed down more. We got a big jump on throttle, but this is where Otis loses the car some, and then a bit of a struggle for Otis in this section here. Again, here we can see how he's patient. Otis a bit more patient on throttle. As we'll see a big difference in the steering angle. A big flick from Fahssi. Not much of a flick from Otis. So we just get the car turned in using more of the brakes as opposed to Fahssi using a bit more of the steering. If you look at where they are on their lap, they're actually, by the time they enter this final corner, they're at a very similar place. So we can look at the 100-meter board. Fahssi just a tiny bit ahead at the 100-meter board. So here onto the braking, they both get a good amount of entry curb, a big flick from Fahssi. Again, the big difference in the amount of curb usage, and the difference of like trailing. Fahssi trails more into the apex. Third to second. Yeah. So that, and then at this point they're basically at the same. Now Otis a tiny bit ahead. So I think Fahssi was actually a little bit slow on that third to second. Or just his line was there's maybe just a tiny bit too much curb here as opposed to Otis. He's actually ahead here, but his line is just a tiny bit more pinched than Otis, who's able to get a better jump on throttle. Again, third maybe a little bit better for traction as opposed to the second. Obviously, a balance of both things. Obviously, both really good laps. But I'll show you Fassi's full lap so you can look at that. Thanks so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. See ya. Bye.
Oh, man, that no messed it up on the last chicane, man. Man.